Hello, this is Kyle again. In the video just before the previous one on the subject of accessibility features, we talked about properties of tkinter widgets. And there was a lot to talk about. We've expanded this a bit with that prior video talking about accessibility related properties and features. And now we're continuing now with talking about geometry managers, which sort of relate to widget properties and are important to consider before you start coding. There are multiple geometry managers that can be used with tkinter. In some of the demo code we've looked at so far, we've just used pack, which is probably the easiest geometry manager to use with tkinter. Pack is a geometry manager that mostly works by stacking all of the controls in the window vertically. So if we added another label to the hello world code that appears here on the right, that was also earlier in this video series, that other label we would add would appear directly underneath the hello world label on your screen when this application is run. There is, in fact, more detail possible using pack, but we've got more control for the types of applications we'll be doing with another geometry manager. The geometry manager that we will mostly be using is the grid geometry manager. This happens to be a good fit for the types of applications that you'll be completing as assignments in this course, and also for the future value application that I've been planning. This is coded a bit differently from pack. Where pack just puts things into a stack, grid aligns them into rows and columns that you can specify, which can make working with a layout quite a bit easier, at least if you start with a plan. If you don't start with a plan, you'll end up rather confused when you're working with a grid layout. There's a snippet of tkinter code for creating a button and assigning it to the grid here. You can call this grid method for tkinter widget, and that's where it gets assigned to the grid. You can see here, this clear button widget is being put on the grid with its row set to 3 and its column set to 1. So what does that mean? About 1 minute ago I said, if you don't start with a plan, you'll end up rather confused when you're working with a grid layout. Well, this is why. Like arrays in Python and in many programming languages, the index is 0 based. This means the top left corner of a grid is row 0, column 0. When you move down the rows, you successively increase the row by 1. So the spot labeled B on the graphic here is at row 1, column 0. What row and column would the spot labeled D be considered? I hope just looking at this that you can answer that. This means the clear button on the previous slide, which had its row set to 3 and its column set to 1, was fairly far down the UI from the top of the window, probably with 3 widgets above it. Those would be at row 0, row 1, and row 2. And it wasn't the leftmost widget either. Usually you'll want to assign rows in a linear way without skipping values, as those skipped values don't have any width or height unless you specify otherwise. To keep things simple, we're just going to count in order. And now we're going to revisit our planning document. Here we are back at our planning document at the top of it, and we're probably not going to scroll down very much, at least not anytime soon. And you can see when you're looking at the visual layout that I prepared earlier, it looks like it's kind of in a grid type design already, doesn't it? It's kind of got 2 rows, or 2 columns I should say, of controls, and then 5 rows. It looks like 5 rows to me. And you can see here in my control list with the properties, it's got the row of label investment prompt, which is this top left label. The names don't match 100% perfectly. And the row is set to 0, and the column is also set to 0. So this is at 0, 0. And then entry investment, which is an entry field for text entry for the user to enter stuff, it has its row set to 0 and its column set to 1. And then the label rate prompt right here has its row set to 1 and its column set to 0. That means we could expect that label years prompt could end up being at row 2, column 0. Label future value would probably be at row 3, column 0. And then the button would end up at row 4, column 0. I suppose that means that this bottom right control, button exit, would end up being at row 4, column 1. Why don't we scroll down and just check my work here? Yeah, I did put that in. It's pretty easy to figure these out when you start with identifying every control and then sketching it, because if things fall into a nice grid-based pattern, it's pretty easy to figure out the rows and columns. And this is really important to do, really important to identify early, since we have to code this stuff one line at a time when we're actually building our user interface in tkinter. So in this video, we looked at geometry managers for tkinter. And as a checkpoint right now, I'd ask you, what are 2 possible geometry managers for tkinter? We did talk about 2 of them in this video, and hopefully you know what those were. I'm not going to ask you more about how to implement or anything like that, because that's really going to come up after we talk about how this is coded. And that's what we're going to do next.